Dawn in Copper Hollow always began with silence, the kind that hung thick as fog over sagging rooftops and half-rotted fences. But that morning, silence shattered with a scream from Widow Marsh's boarding house, sharp as a trapped bird's cry. The door burst open. Thalia Brooks stumbled out, her dress rumpled, her long dark hair undone, her eyes blazing with panic. On her smooth brown skin, tears caught the faint gold of the rising sun. Men on the saloon porch turned their heads. One set down his coffee cup with a frown. The shopkeeper's wife cracked her door open just enough to see. In Copper Hollow, one woman's scream could fuel a month of talk. "I'm not pregnant," Talia cried, her voice shaking. "I haven't done anything wrong." From the doorway, Arabella Marsh stood, thin, gray lace glinting under the early light, her pale face framed by lips red as blood. "Nothing wrong?" she said, her voice high and cutting. "You left your room crying in the middle of the night, and we're to believe nothing happened? This town knows what it sees, Miss Brooks." A wave of whispers rolled through the street. The schoolteacher of Copper Hollow, carrying a child out of wedlock? Gossip traveled faster than chimney smoke. Thalia stepped back, clutching her skirt. Her throat burned, but no words came. Dozens of eyes pinned her in place, some pitying, some cruel, some satisfied. None believed her. "Arabella," she managed, her voice trembling, "you know that's a lie. You want me gone so your niece can have my job." Arabella's smile was thin as frost. "All I want is order. How can a woman of no virtue teach our children?" Windows opened. Footsteps gathered. In those stares, Thalia saw her life unraveling. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Kindness can outlast prejudice. But Copper Hollow didn't believe in kindness. Here, a woman's honor was a thread that snapped at a whisper. "I've done nothing wrong," she said again, weaker this time. From the crowd, a man's voice rang out. "Then who's the father, Miss Brooks?" Another laughed. "Surely she's had offers enough." Heat climbed up her neck. The world spun, and then the sharp clang of iron broke through. A horse stopped in the street, hooves striking the ground with finality. The crowd split apart. A tall man on horseback rode forward, his coat dark with dust, sunlight slanting across broad shoulders. His gaze swept over them, and laughter died in the air. Gideon Cole, owner of the largest ranch in the valley, the kind of man others respected or feared. He stopped before Thalia, his amber eyes shadowed beneath his hat brim. "What's happening here?" he asked, voice low and even. Arabella's tone turned syrupy. "Ah, Mr. Cole, our little school teacher has just confessed to being with child, without a husband." Gideon's eyes met Thalia's. She stood frozen, lips pressed tight, tears catching the morning light. For a heartbeat, he saw someone else, his sister, years ago, destroyed by the same kind of lie. He dropped the reins and stepped down. His voice rolled out like thunder. "If she's carrying a child," he said, "then it's mine." The world went still. The wind, the footsteps, the whispers, all stopped. Arabella's jaw fell open. "You... what did you say?" He turned to her, his stare cold as forged steel. "I said no one will drag Thalia Brooks's name through the dirt. If she needs a man's name to silence you all, it'll be mine." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The gossipers looked down. The cruel ones shut their mouths. Thalia lifted her gaze to him, disbelief and confusion flooding her face. "Why?" she whispered. Gideon didn't answer. He only stepped closer, his hand gentle on her arm, shielding her from the eyes around them. "Come on," he said quietly. "Don't let them feed on you." Her knees trembled, but she followed. No one dared stand in their way. Behind them, the street fell silent, dust rising like breath. At the far end, sunlight poured down, two figures walking side by side through the storm of rumor. And in that blinding light, Thalia realized something she had never seen in Copper Hollow before. Mercy. The murmurs of Copper Hollow still echoed down the main street when Gideon Cole took hold of the reins and led his horse toward Thalia. She hadn't yet caught her breath when he looked down, voice low and steady. "Get on." But her eyes were still wet. "You don't have to. I can get on," he repeated, quiet, not harsh, but with a weight that left no room for refusal. Her hands trembled as she placed one foot on the stirrup. His calloused palm steadied her elbow, lifting her with effortless strength. Once she settled on the front of the saddle, he swung up behind her, his arms closing in to grasp the reins. With a slight tug, the horse surged forward, hooves striking a rhythm against the dry earth. No one spoke, only the sound of hooves and the faint rustle of morning wind. The air smelled of smoke, dew, and dust. Thalia could feel every measured breath behind her, slow, even, warm. Each rise and fall of his chest brushed against her back, his heartbeat steady as a drum, anchoring her in a world that had just turned to chaos. She wanted to look back, to ask why he'd done it. But her throat closed tight. In her mind, she could still hear the jeers, the laughter, and above it all, his voice. "If she's carrying a child, then it's mine." The words had sliced through the crowd like a blade, saving her, yet binding her to him in ways she couldn't understand. After a long stretch, she finally whispered, "You didn't have to do that. They'll believe you. They'll turn on you for it." "Let them try," he said. His voice was deep, almost part of the wind. "They need to fear something more than gossip." The trail west wound through tall grass and rolling hills painted gold by the morning sun. When they stopped by a creek to let the horse drink, she turned toward him. His face in that light was all hard lines and calm shadows, sweat glinting at his temple. There was no cruelty in him, only quiet resolve, like a man who had already seen the world at its worst and decided to stand anyway. She realized, to her own confusion, that it wasn't his strength that drew her gaze. It was the stillness behind it. A silence that didn't hide, but held. Hours later, they reached his ranch, a stretch of land bordered by rustling poplars and rows of weathered fences. The main house stood tall and dark, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber, its porch deep and shaded. Workers looked up as their boss rode in with the town's disgraced schoolteacher seated in front of him. Thalia lowered her head. The weight of their stares pressed like heat on her back. Gideon murmured, "Don't be afraid." A middle-aged Mexican woman stepped out onto the porch, Mrs. Rodriguez, her eyes kind and warm as sunlit water. She took in the sight of them both, understanding more than she asked. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she said softly. "And this young lady is—" "Miss Brooks," Gideon replied, removing his gloves. "She'll be staying here for a while." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, her voice steady. "Of course. I'll ready the south room. You look tired, Miss Brooks. Come inside. Talia thanked her quietly, but before following, she turned back. Gideon was still by the hitching post, pulling off his gloves one finger at a time. His hands were rough and sun-browned, yet his movements were deliberate, almost gentle, like a man careful not to break what's already been bruised. Those same hands had taken hers in front of everyone, shielding her from ruin. Her heart beat faster as she turned away. Inside, the house was simple: polished wood, clean lines, curtains fluttering in the soft light. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her a cup of tea. "Don't worry, Nina," she said kindly. "The boss is a good man. Quiet, yes, but if he says you're safe here, you are." When Gideon stepped through the doorway, the air seemed to change. The faint scent of leather and sunlight followed him. He didn't look directly at her. "You'll be safe here," he said. Talia clasped her hands together. "You just tied your honor to my disgrace." He lifted his gaze, and something unspoken flickered there. "An innocent soul shouldn't fear its own shadow," he said, slow and certain, as if it were law carved into stone. The room fell quiet. Outside, wind moved through the poplars, whispering like a long, steady breath. Talia lowered her eyes, saying nothing, but somewhere deep inside, something fragile stirred. Not gratitude, not fear. Something rarer. The faint, unfamiliar feeling of safety. And as Gideon watched her climb the stairs, her small frame caught in the wash of sunlight, he knew this was the beginning of something that would not end easily. That afternoon, the rain did not stop. Heavy drops drummed against the porch roof, a slow, mournful rhythm that seeped through the boards and into the walls. Thalia sat in the parlor's dim amber light, a cold teacup in her hands, eyes fixed on the fields blurred to gray. The rumor had reached her before dawn. Copper Hollow's school board would soon meet to examine her moral fitness. 3 years of teaching, 3 years of living upright, now reduced to a handful of poisonous whispers that could lock every door. In a town like Copper Hollow, no one asked for proof. They only needed a story sharp enough to believe. The door swung open. Wind and rain spilled in, carrying the smell of wet earth and iron. Gideon Cole stepped through, coat dark and soaked, boots streaked with mud, his calm as unshaken as the storm outside. He set his hat on the table, water pattering onto the floorboards, and looked at us for a long time. Thalia recognized that look. Not pity, but something quieter, heavier, like the gaze of a man who had seen how far a lie could ruin a life. Neither spoke at first. Only the rain and the wind brushed against the porch, filling the silence with their endless sweep. At last he spoke, slow, deliberate, as if each word had been weighed. "There's only one way to make them stop talking." She lifted her head, a small furrow between her brows. He did not look away. "We marry." The words struck the room like an axe splitting wood. Talia let out a short, brittle laugh, but it died as quickly as it came. Tears pushed at the edges of her eyes, not from hope but from exhaustion, from the thought that sometimes a woman had to sell her own freedom just to stand still. He said nothing more, only moved closer, until she could hear the measured rise and fall of his breath above the scent of damp timber and lamp smoke. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "Maybe not," he said, "but I owe myself the duty of doing what's right." She looked down at his hands, scarred, browned by the sun, hands that had pulled ropes and crossed winter fields. They were not gentle in the city's way, but they carried a steadiness that drew trust. She wanted to object, to tell him marriage was no escape, yet part of her knew he was right. In Copper Hollow, truth saved no one. Only a name and a claim could keep a woman from being devoured by the town's tongue. Gideon stood motionless, the lamp's glow catching one side of his face, outlining the hard jaw, the deep blue of his eyes. He didn't try to convince her, didn't speak noble words. There was only something in his gaze, an honesty so stark it took her breath. Then he told her. Not a speech, just a few sentences about his younger sister, branded by a rumor much like this one. She had left town carrying shame that wasn't hers, and never came back. Thalia's chest tightened. In his eyes she saw not only resolve, but a shadow of pain that had never healed. Outside, the rain matched the heavy beat of both their hearts. She stepped closer, not out of surrender, but because she sensed something raw and human in him. A man who had lost once and could not bear to watch another fall the same way. "You've saved me," she murmured, her voice merging with the rain. "But you've also bound your life to mine." He didn't answer right away. For a moment his eyes softened. "Not a binding," he said at last, his voice low as wind sliding along wood. "A choice to stand where right belongs." She turned her face aside, but her lips trembled. The lamplight caught the raindrops still clinging to his hair, making them glint like something both beautiful and painful. She didn't know whether to thank him or resent him. She only knew that from that instant something shifted, inside her, and perhaps inside him too. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside that warm wooden room, the silence was no longer empty. It had become the beginning of a bond neither of them yet had a name for. Rumors shifted direction as swiftly as prairie wind. After that rainy afternoon, Copper Hollow found itself humming with a new story. That Gideon Cole, the quietest man in the valley, had proposed to the town's black schoolteacher. No one knew if it was true, but most chose to believe. Sometimes, faith in an unexpected romance made life a little easier to bear. Thalia heard the whispers each time she went to market. Yet instead of lowering her head, she began to walk taller. Perhaps it was because beside her always stood a broad-shouldered man with a calm stride, a wide hat, and eyes that never flinched from another's gaze. Gideon said nothing, never tried to explain. He simply walked slower so she could keep pace, each step of his landing with quiet certainty, hammering truth into silence. They had agreed on the terms, to pretend to be in love. Just enough appearances, a few gestures, a handful of shared glances to make the town believe his proposal had been real. Gideon offered to take her to market, sometimes stopping at the bakery, sometimes riding along the fields where wild yellow blooms swayed on both sides of the trail. Thalia wasn't used to being watched this way. Every glance, every whisper seemed to burn against her skin, but Gideon paid it no mind. He spoke little, only turning to her now and then to ask if she was tired. His voice so steady, it made her lift her head, wondering what thoughts moved behind that stillness. One morning they rode along the southern ridge. The grass was wet with dew, the sun barely cresting the mountains. Light caught in his hair, turning it the color of burnished copper. Thalia slowed her horse to keep a distance, but a sudden flutter of wings startled her mare. It reared, lunging forward. She nearly fell until an arm caught her waist, firm and sure. For a breathless instant, the world went silent. She heard nothing but her heartbeat, wild and unfamiliar. His arm, warm through the fabric of her dress, held her steady, strong enough that even fear gave way to calm. He didn't speak. His eyes met hers, clear, unguarded, like wind sweeping through open fields, cool and endless. She couldn't look away. The scent of leather, smoke, and faint old rain clung to him, grounding her in a place that suddenly felt too still. When he finally let go, his touch lingered just long enough for her to know he was still there. She steadied herself, cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Nothing to be sorry for," he said, voice as light as the breeze that passed between them. They rode on without words, but the silence had changed. No longer empty, it carried the echo of her racing heart and the ghost of his hand at her waist. Days later, they went to market together. The shopkeepers' wives looked on, nodding, whispering behind their hands. When Thalia reached for apples, Gideon took one, wiped it on his sleeve, and handed it to her without breaking eye contact. A small gesture, nothing more. Yet in the eyes of the town, it was proof of tenderness. Thalia didn't speak, only accepted the apple, feeling as though something unnamed had been placed in her palm. She began to notice things about him, how he watched before he acted, how his words were few but exact, how promises, once spoken, were treated as law. There was a quiet strength beneath his silence, a kind of sincerity that made her want to understand him more deeply. On evenings when they rode home, the sun poured gold across his shoulders, softening every hard line. Sometimes he'd stop his horse midway, just so she could take in the fields changing color under dusk. When she asked why he chose to live so far from town, he simply said, "It's quiet here. Things speak through what's done, not what's said." The answer stayed with her through the night. Maybe he was that very thing, a man who spoke through deeds, not words. By the end of the month, nearly everyone in Copper Hollow believed they were to be married. Children from her class brought wildflowers to the ranch. Mrs. Rodriguez mended an old lace kerchief for her. Even those who once whispered now offered cautious smiles. But what unsettled Talia's heart wasn't the gossip. It was that single moment on the ridge, the feel of his arm around her, the breath of silence between them, and the quiet certainty that something wordless had taken root there, as softly as rain sinking into dry earth. The night of the dinner came as spring brushed the edge of summer. There was no silk, no orchestra, only the scent of burning wood and wildflowers set in glass jars along the porch. On the Cole Ranch lawn, lanterns swayed from strings, their golden light flickering like low-hanging stars. More people came than Thalia had imagined. Faces that once avoided her now smiled politely, offering handshakes and blessings. Perhaps it wasn't understanding that had changed them, but belief. Belief in what they saw. A steadfast man and the woman he had chosen, openly, to stand beside him. Gideon appeared in a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly combed, that calm steadiness about him making the crowd fall quiet as he passed. And Thalia, in a pale blue dress Mrs. Rodriguez had lovingly altered, looked like something half-dreamed, gentle, distant, with a light in her eyes that tried to hide a feeling she couldn't yet name. The evening began with polite laughter and the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of a Mexican boy's guitar drifting through the air. Thalia sat among them, listening to talk about an unexpected love between two people who couldn't be more different. She smiled when spoken to, offered polite replies, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere, pulled again and again to the quiet figure across the table. Each time she turned her head, Gideon's gaze was there. It didn't press or demand, it simply held, calm and unwavering, until her heart forgot its rhythm. Midway through the night, Gideon rose to speak. No one had asked him to, yet the entire lawn fell silent. He lifted a glass, his large hand dwarfing the fragile stem. The lantern light cast his shadow high across the wall. Tall, defined, unshakable. His voice carried through the hush, deep and even, like thunder rolling far across the plains. "I know some of you believe this marriage comes from rumor," he said, "that I've done this out of pity or for the sake of honor. But the truth is, I didn't choose marriage to silence gossip." He paused, eyes finding hers in the crowd. Thalia's breath caught. "I chose it because I believe she's the kind of woman worth walking beside for the rest of my life." The space between them stilled. Even the wind seemed to stop. Around them, people sat frozen, lanterns flickering in the quiet. Thalia felt her hands tremble. His words cut through their agreement, stepping beyond the safe line they had drawn. He had crossed first, and she didn't know whether to retreat or follow. When the crowd broke into applause and laughter returned, she could barely hear it. Warmth flooded her chest, sweet, terrifying warmth. If he meant what he'd said, she knew her heart wouldn't stand a chance. The night lingered long after the music faded. The sun had long slipped behind the ridge, leaving only moonlight stretched across the fields. When the last guests departed, the air grew still again, filled with the faint scent of grass and wood smoke. Gideon walked her to the porch. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Moonlight traced a thin silver path between them on the worn wooden steps. He stood close enough that she could feel the quiet strength of his breath just above her shoulder. She didn't lift her gaze, but she could feel his eyes on her, steady and unhurried, touching without touching. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice slipping into the night, almost lost among the chirring crickets. He didn't answer right away. Only the sound of his coat shifting, and then his voice, low, sure, carrying something that felt like a promise. "We're only just beginning, Talia." She looked up. In the moon's pale glow, his eyes had turned the color of dark bronze, reflecting her own silhouette within them. The space between them was no wider than a breath, yet neither of them broke it. Perhaps both knew, if they did, everything that had been pretend would become real, and there would be no turning back. She stepped away first. He lowered his head slightly, accepting the distance without a word. As she turned toward the door, her hand rose to her chest, feeling the quick, unsteady beat beneath. Talia knew she wouldn't sleep that night. Not from fear of the town anymore, but from fear of herself. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and bright, as if Copper Hollow had been washed clean by the night's rain. The air smelled of damp earth and young grass, and a mild wind moved through the wildflowers blooming along the church fence. People arrived early, not out of devotion, but curiosity. The town had never seen a wedding so talked about. The small church stood at the end of a dirt road, its shingles silvered with age, ivy crawling up its wooden walls. Inside, candles flickered against the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the pews, until the room looked almost too peaceful for a place that had hosted so much gossip. Every seat was filled. The murmurs stilled when Talia stepped through the doorway. She wore no veil, no jewels, just a simple white dress sewn from old silk Mrs. Rodriguez had saved for years. Her dark hair was neatly pinned, a few wildflowers tucked above her ear. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the man waiting at the altar. Gideon stood there in a crisp white shirt and a dark gray coat, his tall frame steady but his hands tense at his sides. When she drew near, sunlight poured through the window behind him, lighting his face, and for a heartbeat, every rumor, every harsh word seemed to dissolve in that glow. No one told him to look at her the way he did, as though nothing else in the world was worth seeing. When Talia reached him, the room fell utterly still. The wind slipped through a crack in the door, carrying the scent of flowers, soft and clean. Reverend Miller smiled gently, his voice calm as he asked, "My son, do you have any words for your bride?" Gideon's fingers tightened around hers, warm, solid, grounding. He looked straight into her eyes, not reading from the worn vows in the Reverend's hand, but speaking his own, low and measured, each word carved into the air. "I will believe you when the world will not." Just one sentence, but it stilled the Reverend's lips, made his eyes glisten. The little church seemed to hold its breath. Thalia trembled, tears rising faster than she could blink away. Her reply came in a whisper, light as wind through grass. "And I will walk beside you, no matter how empty the road becomes." The Reverend nodded, voice thick with feeling, and spoke the final blessing. Sunlight filtered through the colored glass, laying a warm golden stripe across their joined hands, sealing what words alone could not. When he finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Gideon leaned down. His kiss was slow, sure, and unhurried, neither for show nor defiance, but a quiet promise made before God and man alike. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the breath returned to the room, a soft collective sigh. Outside, the day burst open in light. The field beyond the church shimmered, wildflowers trembling in the breeze. Children tossed handfuls of petals into the air, laughter ringing like bells. The townsfolk murmured among themselves, some touched, some uncertain. But none dared call it false, because in that single kiss, every onlooker saw the truth in their eyes. Thalia leaned gently into Gideon's shoulder as they stepped from the church. The noise behind them faded into a soft blur. He bent closer, voice low enough for her alone. "You all right?" She nodded, smiling faintly. "Never been more at peace." They walked down the stone steps, sunlight spilling across them like a blessing. A breeze swept through, lifting her hem, scattering petals into his hair. Gideon laughed, a rare sound, deep and quiet, softening his whole face. At the foot of the steps, Thalia looked up. The air carried the scent of sunlight and open fields, and for the first time, every fear, every doubt she'd carried seemed to drift away. She had always thought he was the one who saved her. But in that moment, bathed in light, surrounded by applause that felt far away, she understood. He too had been saved, from a solitude deeper than rumor could touch. It was a wedding born beneath the weight of judgment, in a town still learning to believe in goodness. Yet for Thalia and Gideon, it was the first morning of something real. Fragile, yes, but beyond pretense. And under that clear, forgiving sky, as they kissed once more, even Copper Hollow felt it. Sometimes love doesn't begin with choice. It begins when two souls dare to believe in each other. The storm came on the second night after the wedding. Wind tore through the pines behind the ranch. Rain hammered the tin roof in wild, restless rhythms. All of Copper Hollow lay beneath a wash of silver gray. That strange, heavy silence only rain can make. Thalia couldn't sleep. The lamp on the bedside flickered weakly, throwing her shadow long across the wall, thin, trembling like a held breath. She rose, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. Before her, the world was made of rain. Droplets slid from the eaves, shattering into threads of light beneath the lamp's glow. She stood there, arms folded tight, unsure why she'd come, only that something inside her twisted at the thought of being known now as Gideon Cole's wife. It wasn't the title that frightened her. It was the truth buried inside it, the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready to feel. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Gideon was coming down the hallway, rain still clinging to his coat, his hair damp and glinting under the light. He'd been out at the stables, fighting the storm all night. The lamp glow caught on his shoulders, turning each drop of water to silver. "You're cold," he said quietly, voice deep and roughened by the wind. He draped a wool scarf over her shoulders. His fingers brushed her skin, chilled, damp, but steady. The small, unthinking kindness of it made her chest tighten. "You've done too much for me already," she murmured, eyes on the rain. He stood beside her a moment, silent but solid, before answering, slow, deliberate, a confession stripped of pretense. "No. I did it because I wanted to." She turned toward him. His face was close now, close enough that she could see the raindrops clinging to his lashes, the faint tremor in his breath. He didn't look at her at first, his gaze fixed on the storm rolling over the fields. Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked. Then his eyes found hers. Neither spoke. Something broke open between them. Quiet. Inevitable. The storm outside roared, but the world within them stilled. He stepped closer until his breath brushed her cheek. Talia didn't move away. Her eyes flickered once, then held. And when his lips met hers, the rain seemed to stop altogether. The kiss came without warning, unplanned, unguarded, burning with honesty. Thalia tasted the earth, the smoke, the salt of a man who had lived too long in silence. Every wall inside her gave way, not because of what he said, but because of how he held her, as though the world could collapse and he still would not let her fall. The door swung open with a gust of wind. They stepped inside, carrying the scent of rain and old wood. Gideon closed it behind them. When he turned, his eyes were no longer those of a man bound by duty, but of someone who had forgotten how to pretend. She stood in the dim light, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her gaze met his, unflinching. No words followed. The rain outside filled the silence, their breathing merging with its rhythm, quick, then slowing, deepening into something steady and sure. Every movement was uncertain, yet each touch felt right, like a truth they'd been circling since the first lie of their arrangement. He pressed a kiss to her neck, then paused, searching her face, asking the question without speaking. And Thalia, trembling but certain, nodded. That night, they gave themselves completely, without vows, without plans, without fear. Just two souls stripped bare of pretense, finding warmth in the middle of the storm. By the time the rain began to ease, the first light of dawn had already crept across the sky. Gideon slept beside her, his breathing deep and calm. Thalia lay still, her heartbeat keeping time with the soft drip of rain against the window. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt no fear of what the town might say, because tonight had told her everything she needed to know. The rest of the world could doubt, whisper, or judge. But this warmth beside her was real, and no rumor could take it away. Outside, the rain still fell, but inside that quiet room, spring had already come. The first days of marriage drifted by softly, like thin smoke curling from the porch roof at dawn. After the storm, the sky turned a shade of clean, endless blue. Everything on the Cole ranch seemed to still, the rain-soaked fields glinting in sunlight, the whispering pines, the mornings that began not with gossip from town, but with the distant sound of horses stirring in the stalls. Thalia rose earlier than before. She had fallen into the rhythm of the ranch, setting the table, brewing coffee, waiting for the steady footfalls of Gideon returning from the stables. At first, there lingered a polite distance between them, as though both were careful not to step too close to the memory of the rain-soaked night. Yet as the days passed, that distance thinned without either noticing how or when. In the afternoons, she read to him on the porch. The sunlight stretched long across the wooden boards, the air filled with the scent of hay and pine. Gideon listened, head bent, his brow furrowed in concentration as he repeated her words. Slow, rough, halting. His voice caught on certain phrases, his tongue heavy with unfamiliar rhythm. She laughed softly, not in mockery but in warmth, her fingers tracing the lines on the page as she guided him through each word. His hand rested nearby, rough, sunburned, and when their fingertips brushed, her breath caught for reasons she couldn't name. He wasn't a man of speech, but he noticed everything. When she coughed, he poured water without a word. When she arranged wildflowers on the table, he stood behind her, steadying the vase so it wouldn't tip. And slowly, their silences began to feel less like gaps and more like home, full instead of empty. In return, Gideon taught her how to ride and shoot. Thalia had never held a gun before. She had seen them only in men's hands, hard, heavy, and meant for harm. But when he placed the small revolver in her palms, his touch covered hers, steadying, teaching. His hands were coarse but warm, and that warmth quieted her fear. "Don't be afraid," he said softly, his breath close enough that she felt it against her neck. "It's only dangerous when the one holding it doubts themselves." She nodded, still trembling. The first shot missed entirely, skimming past the wooden target. Gideon didn't laugh. He simply stepped closer, adjusting her grip, his hand enclosing hers. The second shot rang across the open sky, clean and sure, dead center. She turned to him, eyes bright, chest rising fast. He smiled, that rare, quiet smile that softened every edge of him. In that moment, she realized he wasn't only the man who had saved her from a rumor. He was the man teaching her to see herself differently. At night, they shared quiet routines. She read, He Mended Tack by the Fire. Every so often, one of them looked up, and their eyes met. A smile would pass between them, unspoken but full. One evening, she read aloud the final lines of a poem, words about how love isn't proven by promises, but by staying through the silent days. When she finished, she closed the book, her finger resting on the last page. "Do you understand what it means?" she asked softly. Gideon looked up, the firelight catching his face, half shadow, half glow. "I think," he said after a pause, "love doesn't need to be understood. You just have to live long enough to prove it's real." The answer stayed with her through the night. When the lamps were out, and his breathing had fallen into its steady rhythm, Thalia lay awake beside him, watching the quiet rise and fall of his chest. She thought about how love had come to her, not as a grand gesture, but as the small, ordinary things he did without thinking. The way he looked at her as though she were the only truth he believed in. And as she listened to his slow, even breathing, Talia knew she loved him. No words had been spoken, but she didn't need them. It was there, in every glance, every silence, every act of quiet care, a love born not from vows, but from presence. Summer returned to Copper Hollow with its golden light, and the faint scent of wild grass singed beneath the noonday sun. The dirt roads cracked and shimmered with dust. Yet what had truly dried away in town was not the rain. It was the gossip. Arabella Marsh, once the loudest voice in every crowd, now walked the streets in silence. The greetings that used to follow her had thinned to nothing. Shopkeepers nodded stiffly. Women turned aside, busying themselves with baskets and doors. The same mouths that once repeated her words now kept shut. In a town where talk had once been a weapon, silence became the harshest sentence. Her standing eroded slowly, like a house eaten from within by termites. No one mentioned her anymore, and that, Talia thought, was the cruelest kind of justice. For Thalia, life had changed in the opposite way. One bright June morning, she unlocked the little schoolhouse at the end of Main Street. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight as the door swung open, and children's laughter echoed across the room. Dozens of small faces turned toward her, eyes wide and bright, their voices rising together in a cheerful chorus. "Good morning, Mrs. Cole." She froze for half a second. The words, simple and tender, trembled in the air like a note plucked from fine glass. Then she smiled, a quiet, full smile, and returned the greeting, her voice soft but sure. The day began as though no storm had ever passed. Each morning she rode her bicycle down the sunlit street, the townsfolk waving as she passed. Their smiles no longer carried pity, but respect. They spoke of her now with warmth, how Mrs. Cole kept the school open through the hardest days, how she taught their children to read, to write, and to be kind. The old rumor had vanished, replaced by small stories of kindness, of Thalia's patience, and of her husband, who often brought crates of books from Denver for the school. In the late afternoons, Gideon would appear without warning. She would hear him before she saw him. The muffled thud of boots, the soft nicker of his horse outside, the stillness that followed. Then his shadow would fall through the open window, carrying the faint scent of leather and dust. In his hand, a small bouquet of wildflowers from the hills behind their home. Thalia never turned right away. She simply smiled, sensing him there. His presence said everything his words did not. That quiet promise he'd once made, "I will believe you when the world will not." When the lessons ended, Gideon helped her tidy the benches. The evening light spread across his shoulders, painting the old wooden sign above the door, Copper Hollow School, in shades of amber and gold. "The children are good," he said once, his voice low, threaded with pride. "They're why I stayed," Talia replied with a small smile. "Maybe everything just needed time to calm." He didn't answer. He only reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, certain, and in it she felt something deeper than words, a quiet mending that reached all the way to her heart. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the porch. They stepped outside together, the last light of day pooling around their feet. Gideon took her hand, his thumb tracing the back of it in silence. Far off, the church bell tolled, slow, steady, like the heartbeat of a town finally at peace. The rumor that once tore apart a woman's dignity was now nothing more than a fading story. It had dissolved into the warm air of Copper Hollow, replaced by the quiet steadiness of two lives that had chosen to trust, to endure, and to love, without spectacle, without defense. And as the last bell note drifted away, Thalia leaned into Gideon's shoulder, her eyes half closed, breathing in the scent of pine and sunlight. The town that once watched her fall now watched her simply live, and somewhere in that hush, she knew, the storm had passed. Their first winter came gentler than they expected. Snow blanketed the roof in a soft hush, flakes drifting slow across the windowpane, melting and freezing again into a fine glassy frost. Inside, the fire cast golden shapes along the walls, quiet, flickering breaths of warmth that made the small room feel like the center of the world. Talia sat on the rug near the hearth, a thick wool shawl draped around her shoulders, listening to the fire crackle. Outside, wind rushed through the pines, but within those four walls, there was only calm. Gideon had just come in from the stables, his coat dusted with snow, the smell of wind and wood smoke still clinging to him. He hung the coat by the door, brushed the frost from his hair, and came to sit beside her. She looked up and smiled. As always, he took his place close, his presence carrying the quiet weight of home. Their days had fallen into a steady rhythm. Work, simple meals, evenings spent by the fire with a book between them. Yet something inside her had changed, slow and tender, like spring water running beneath the frozen earth. When her breath had steadied, Talia reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, the skin weathered by rope and rain, but in her grasp it was warm as a promise. "Gideon," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the fire's whisper. He turned, eyes amber in the light. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she took his hand and guided it gently to rest against her stomach. A small, simple gesture, yet it stilled the whole room. "The rumor from back then," she murmured, lips trembling around a smile, "has finally become true." For several heartbeats, Gideon couldn't move. The firelight rippled over his face, and Talia saw astonishment, joy, and something deeper, a reverence too large for words. He searched her face as if afraid he'd misheard. Then his shoulders shook once, and a sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. A smile broke through, bright and unguarded. "Thalia." His voice was rough with emotion. "This time I don't have to pretend." Her breath caught. That simple truth undid her. All that pain, the gossip, the shame, the years of being doubted, suddenly felt distant, almost weightless. What remained was this quiet, undeniable thing between them. A life growing from love, not rumor, in the home they had built together from ruins. Gideon lowered his forehead to hers. His hand stayed where it was, resting lightly, almost reverently, afraid to disturb the miracle. She could hear his heartbeat, strong, sure, alive. "Aren't you afraid?" he whispered. Talia shook her head, her voice soft as snow. "No, not this time, because now I have you." The fire glowed brighter, painting their faces in gold. Outside, the wind howled, but its sound only made the warmth between them deeper. They stayed there a long while, speaking little. A quiet flame burned between them, not only in the hearth, but in their hearts, lit by everything they had endured: fear, loss, and the long, patient labor of trust. At last, Gideon drew her close. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing, steady as the wind against the windows. They didn't speak of the future or the past. Everything they needed was here, in the warmth of his arms, in the heartbeat beneath the rough wool of his sweater. A stray snowflake slipped through a crack in the door and landed on the rug beside them, melting into a single drop of water. Talia looked up at the faint light on the window pane and thought of how life's blessings rarely come as gold or glory. Sometimes they arrive quietly, as a man who once stood alone against a crowd and now sits beside you, believing in the miracle growing within. Gideon pressed a kiss to her forehead, slow and tender, sealing the moment into memory. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not running away from this life." Talia smiled against his chest, her voice a breath. "We've both run far enough. It's time to stay and live." The firelight danced across their faces, soft and endless. And in that glow, the world outside disappeared, leaving only the image of two souls who had weathered every storm and finally found their true blessing, the peace of being home. Winter slipped away quietly, leaving thin ribbons of ice melting along the eaves. When the first green shoots broke through the thawing soil, Thalia knew the time had come. That morning, Copper Hollow smelled of wet earth. The spring wind drifted through the cracked window frames, carrying the faint warmth of the new season. In the small room washed in golden light, Gideon sat beside her, his calloused hands gripping hers tightly. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though he wasn't the one in labor. Thalia's breath came quick, shallow. She didn't cry out. She never had been one to yield to pain. Each wave of contraction rolled through her like a tide, fierce and steady, but his hand anchored her, solid as the earth after a storm. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice low and trembling. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the sky was so blue it seemed impossible that winter had ever existed. Mrs. Rodriguez moved quietly in the room, murmuring soft prayers under her breath, while Gideon kept his grip firm, repeating small, broken words to himself, half prayer, half disbelief. When the cry finally came, small, sharp, and pure, Gideon froze. For a moment, even the wind seemed to still. Then Mrs. Rodriguez smiled and placed the tiny red, trembling life onto Thalia's chest. Thalia looked down, tears flooding her eyes, not from pain, but awe. The baby's fingers curled around hers, impossibly small, impossibly strong. Gideon leaned closer, his eyes shining with wetness he didn't try to hide. He touched Thalia's hair, slick with sweat, and then reached, with trembling hands, to stroke the child's head. "This little one," he murmured, voice breaking, "is proof that good can grow from pain." Thalia smiled through tears, tired, radiant, unguarded. "Grace," she whispered. "We'll name her Grace Cole." He repeated it slowly, as if the sound itself was holy. Grace, a gift undeserved. Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, soft and warm, a gentle music against the roof. The droplets mingled with Gideon's quiet laughter as he gazed at his daughter for the first time. Thalia held the baby close, feeling her tiny warmth against her chest. All the words, the rumors, the cruel glances, they dissolved in that single heartbeat. There was no past left to defend, no burden left to carry. Only love, plain, real, unashamed. she whispered, though she didn't know if it was to him, to their child, or to the life that had finally forgiven her. Thank you for letting me begin again. Gideon sat at her side, his hand still wrapped around hers. The firelight flickered across three faces, a man once wounded, a woman once shamed, and the child born from their faith in each other. He kissed Thalia's forehead, then looked at the tiny girl, his voice rough with wonder. Welcome to the world, Grace. You were born from love, not from talk. Thalia laughed weakly, her voice soft, but bright. That sounded almost like poetry. He arched a brow, pretending to be serious. Then it's the only poem I'll ever write, for the two I love most. Outside, the rain began to ease. Light spilled through the window, glinting off the small cradle he had built over sleepless nights. Inside lay a folded cream-colored blanket, waiting for its first dream. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the doorway, smiling through her tears. The Lord has returned to you what the world once stole, she said quietly. Gideon didn't answer. He only looked at his wife and child, his heart too full for words. That night, while Copper Hollow slept, the light in their little house stayed on. Wind whispered through the cracks, a baby stirred, and Thalia's voice, soft as a hymn, filled the air. Sleep, my little Grace. Gideon sat nearby, watching them both, the fire reflecting in his eyes. Do you know, Thalia, he said quietly, everything we lost, maybe it was only to make room for this. Thalia didn't reply. She only nodded, tears tracing her cheeks. The kind of tears that no longer hurt. The kind that come when a soul steps fully out of the dark and finds at last the light. Years had passed since Copper Hollow last whispered about the dark-skinned seamstress and the man named Cole. The rumor that once burned through every porch and parlor had long turned to dust, like an old scar now part of the skin itself. The Cole Ranch stretched wide along the western hills, its pastures rolling all the way to the edge of the pine woods, where the wind always carried the scent of hay and warm earth. New barns stood where old fences once leaned, the granaries were full, and the little house that had once sheltered two exiles now sat beneath a curtain of willow branches, its porch ringed with wildflowers. Inside came the sounds of life, light, happy sounds, children's laughter, small feet clattering across the wooden floor. Grace Cole was 8 now, her curls soft as clouds, her eyes bright and curious like her mother's. Beside her ran her younger brother, just 3, legs short and unsteady but determined to keep up. Thalia still taught, though not in the old schoolhouse by town. Her classroom was now here, on the ranch, open to any child. Farmhands' sons, neighbors' daughters, and those the main school had once turned away. Above the slate board hung the words she carved herself. Learn to believe that kindness still has a place in this world. She told her students often that not everyone is born trusted, but anyone can live in a way that earns trust back. The children listened as if to a fable, never realizing the tale was true, and she was its proof. Gideon remained the same, quiet, steady, his calm a kind of strength that made even silence feel safe. Most days he worked out on the fields. Each evening he came home with sunlight in his hair and dust on his shirt. The children would run to meet him, and Thalia, standing beneath the porch, would smile, her eyes carrying the same light as the day he'd once said, "I will believe you when the world will not." That evening, a soft wind drifted across the prairie, bringing the scent of dry grass and blooming clover. The sunset spread gold and rose across the sky, tinting the windows of their house. Thalia sat sewing Grace's torn sleeve at the table when the rumble of wagon wheels echoed in the yard. A figure stepped down, Arabella Marsh. No longer the proud woman wrapped in silk, but someone smaller, older, with gray hair loose around her shoulders. Her steps were slow, her voice rough with age. "Mrs. Cole," she said quietly, eyes lowered. "I came to apologize." Silence held the room for a long breath. Talia looked up, the same woman whose words had once destroyed her. But there was no anger left in her gaze, only the calm light of evening. "You owe me nothing," Talia said softly. "I already have everything I need." Arabella's lips trembled. She gave a small nod, then turned away. As her wagon rolled down the dusty road, the wind lifted a handful of wildflower petals into the air. Farewell enough, without words, Gideon came to the doorway and placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "You all right?" "I am," she answered, smiling faintly. "In truth, I should thank her." He frowned a little. "Thank her?" Talia turned to him, eyes warm as the last light of dusk. "Because without that rumor, I might never have met you." He chuckled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. She rested her head against his shoulder, and together they watched their children chasing each other across the grass, their laughter ringing through the long golden light. The horizon burned red, the sun sinking behind the hills and spilling its final glow over the porch. Talia whispered, almost to herself, "One rumor once ruined me, but it also led me to something true." Gideon said nothing, just tightened his hand around hers. They stood together in the hush, listening to the wind move through the fields, carrying the scent of hay, hearth smoke, and a life that had endured every storm to find its peace. Grace tumbled into the grass, laughing, while her brother ran to pull her up. Their voices rose, bright and free, carried far across the prairie, toward the hills where spring was already returning.